Good morning from SIPA in Washington, DC, and good afternoon to all of you watching us online from Europe. My name is Corina Rebeja. I'm a program director here at the Center for European Policy Analysis. And I'm very happy you were able to join us for a virtual conversation on the future of the Eastern Partnership countries in this time of uncertainty. Just a quick note to say that we are also live on YouTube and Twitter. We're happy to take questions from our followers on Twitter. Of course, from all of you who have decided to log in on and join our webinar on Zoom. And I'm very, very grateful for a very distinguished panel to discuss the future of Eastern Partnership countries, like I said today. You may know that SIPA has been running a series of virtual events exploring the impact of the crisis on the transatlantic community writ large. And also you may know that at SIPA, we see the Eastern Partnership country as an important piece of transatlantic security. And in particular, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia are very important for the future of the alliance and for European stability in general. And I would also add that these three countries are crucial for the promise and for the vitality of the idea of Europeanization and of the Western model of governance. So what happens to the trajectory and developments in these countries will have an impact on the future of Western model of democratic governance as we know it. So here to talk about the countries of Eastern Partnership, we have three experts from the region, and I'll briefly introduce them before we start our conversation. First, I will start with Mrs. Oksana Siroid from Ukraine. She is the president of Samopomych Union Political Party and also the co-chair of the Lviv Security Forum. She has extensive experience in both the nonprofit sector in Ukraine and, of course, as a member of parliament and politician, and has contributed to a lot of the discussions on reforms on a variety of issues that Ukraine has been going through in recent years. Second, Mr. Nicu Popescu, who is the director of the wider Euro program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, a European think tank, and a former Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Integration of the Republic of Moldova. He was also previously a senior analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies and an advisor on foreign policy to the Prime Minister of Moldova, with, again, extensive experience on Eastern Partnership countries, European integration, and of course, some political experience, as I mentioned. And last but not least, Mr. Tengiz Kaladze, and I apologize for my poor pronunciation of Georgian names. Again, an expert in foreign affairs and security issues from Georgia, has held various positions in the administration, most notably advisor to the president of Georgia on foreign relations, and of course working on diplomatic protocol as a vice governor, and in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Georgia. And he is currently affiliated with the International Center of Geopolitical Studies and the Georgian Institute of Public Affairs. Not to keep this introduction very long, I'm just going to say that in dealing with the coronavirus crisis, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia have displayed various levels of effectiveness. Observers say Georgia has stood out as being quite effective. But I think in all of these countries, and of course, we've seen that all across the transatlantic space, the pandemic has also exposed grave governance gaps. But as we talk about the pandemic and its implications, and as this crisis takes front stage in most conversations these days, I think there is a concern that other existing or evolving crises might be obscured. So perhaps we could turn to our panelists and see what the impact of the pandemic as we see it now has been on political processes that are already underway in these countries and on their particular security situation, as well as the security of their own countries. So perhaps to start with, I will turn to Oksana to give us just a brief overview on the impact of the coronavirus in Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Corinna. Thank you very much for the great opportunity. Thank you to SIPA for arranging such an event. This is great that we have a chance to talk about this, because I do agree that there are common challenges for the countries in the region, so-called Eastern Partnership region. But I would consider this region even broader, the Black Sea, Baltic Black Sea region, which is very much important for the security in the region. So but when I speak about Ukraine, I think that the COVID pandemic as a challenge exploded, and it showed it to at least to the public in Ukraine, limited capability of the model of the government that has been established in Ukraine since the beginning of the independence. And this is not a secret that Ukraine is still governed to the big extent by the so-called oligarchic consensus, where the big monopolists, they have the huge impact not only on the economy, but also on the political sector. And this pandemic showed that this model of the governance is not capable and is not ready for any challenges that is coming from the outside, and what the real challenges that comes to Ukraine. This is my number one observation. Number two, definitely it's Russia and Russian intents that are unchanged, and Russia definitely is using the pandemic to get the benefits from this in different directions. First of all, Russia, of course, is trying to lift or to minimize the sanctions, claiming the pandemic and trying to say that, okay, it's a water peacetime, let's come to peace altogether because of the pandemic. At the same time, which is very important, I think, to know that during all of the period of the pandemic, Russia is killing every day people on the east of Ukraine. Every day we have casualties, and we have either deaths or serious injuries on the east of Ukraine, which is caused by Russia. It's not separatists or whatever. And this is the threat from Russia in the geopolitical level, on the international level. And the third thing I would also refer to as a challenge and as a fragility. Naturally, the pandemic took us all to the micro level. So naturally, under the threat of to the health of the human being, people that concerned about their personal health, the personal health of their relatives, very close people, and it also come to the countries. So countries, they are closing up, they're trying to to be inside of themselves. That limits the cooperation between the country, and actually it plays in favor to Russia as well, And here, considering that we are speaking about the Eastern Partnership region, I believe that we have, on the contrary, we have to extend communication and cooperation between, in particular, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, to secure the region and to share the understanding of the threats and to build the common strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Just a quick follow-up question before we move on to the other panelists. Is your perception that the focus on the pandemic and the current public health crisis is diverting attention from the more structural issues that Ukraine is confronting with, including the security situation? I mean, Russian aggression in Eastern Ukraine is not new. Do you think the responses, particularly those from the international community, Ukraine's allies and partners, have sort of mellowed down as a result of the crisis?
I think that still we have to look deeper inside, because we should not treat the symptoms. We should treat the reason of the problem, the true cause of the problem. And the true cause of the problem, this is the oligarchic system and the dependency, still the dependency of Ukrainian political system from Russia, because the leverage part of the Ukrainian oligarchs, they're dependent on Russia anyway. And for example, the critical infrastructure, we have like 75% of critical infrastructure enterprises. They are either owned by Russians or owned by pro-Russian oligarchs. And this is the real cause of the problem that makes Ukrainian economy vulnerable, that makes Ukrainian healthcare system vulnerable, because taxes are not paid in Ukraine. So I think the COVID pandemic showed us exactly the incapability, the decay of this oligarchic consensus in the country. And we have to take this chance actually to change the consensus and to bring another consensus to the country where the oligarch will be lifted, you know, and actually they would become the normal big enterprise entrepreneurs, not the big monopolist who owns the political system. And then we will be less dependent on the international financial monetary fund or other financial institution. We will be more appropriate partner for the European community countries and so on. So in principle, it's time to revise the system.
Probably easier said than done, and perhaps we can come back to this later on in the conversation and see what forces might contribute to those structural changes that you're talking about. Turning to Tengiz now, and I think Georgia is confronting similar issues with an active conflict on its territory and active Russian aggression. And some of the recent news I've seen about Russia is that there are new border posts opening in Abkhazia. Similarly, in Moldova and Transnistria, hopefully we'll be talking about that too. And observers are talking about a de facto borderization and kind of entrenchment of these so-called republics. So what has the international community missed in the context of this crisis in terms of Georgia's security and regional security?
Thank you. First of all, let me also start with gratitude and thanks Sepa and your great team for this opportunity. And I'm also happy to see Oksana and Nico and welcome this chance to have conversation with you. So Georgia, also coronavirus and this pandemic, it's the serious challenge for this country, although the picture is quite positive. Let's say we have 540 cases and almost 180 already recovered. But this is a serious challenge. The different is the situation on the occupied territories, and regrettably, population are suffering, and they had problem to access the normal medical treatment, and the de facto regimes, they closed so-called border, and the people are not allowed to cross the occupation line. At the same time, as you mentioned, while the world is thinking and the leaders are thinking about cooperation and about peace and how to cope pandemic, this time Russia used this as an opportunity to kidnapping people, to exercise at the occupied territory, to constructing fences and so on. So this is how situation looks at the occupied territories. At the same time, you know that thanks to support of United States, Georgia coped this problem, and very important as an asset of our national security in this battle with coronavirus is the Lugar laboratory, which was constructed years ago and operated very efficiently. And Russian propaganda and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Maria Zakharova, they again blamed Georgia that we are part of war, biological war, which leads by United States and so on. So we, from one side, we face pandemic, and at the same time, it's like the infodemic, the Russia propaganda attempts to show distrust, division, panic in our society, discredit Georgian government, discredit our partners, United States, NATO, European Union, and so on. So we once again we managed to cope this problem, and thanks God, today Georgian population thinks it feels itself quite safe despite of this spread of this pandemic. Also, I would like to touch challenges for the Eastern Partnership itself, because the one point is the pandemic, but another point is that how our role and how our future will be look the post-virus crisis, because this lockdown caused serious damage for our economy. And I think this is the actual issue. We have to cooperate it more and think about the exit strategies. I will stop here and open for the question.
Thank you, Tengiz. I think one of the things we've been hearing recently, reports from Russia and how Russia has been dealing with the crisis, seems to show that it's on a descending, it's a powering crisis, right? The oil prices are down, Putin's approval ratings are at an all-time low. So we are expecting sort of a weakening of the regime in Russia, and a weakening of Russia as a regional and international actor. However, we've heard this discourse quite a lot in the past years, at least since 2014. So I was wondering, just because you touched on future prospects, how do you see the threat coming from the Kremlin in particular, both in terms of hybrid, but also sort of military aggression in the next months and year or so?
Thank you for this question. As you know, Russia's strategy doesn't change, and always when they have problem, they always try to find the enemy outside of the country and blame entire world in the problem the Kremlin regime and Putin had. At the same time, it's kind of perception that the Russian population endure and that they had this ability to endure and not to protest. It's hard to predict now how the situation will develop in Russia inside, but it's anyway the neighbors like we are, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, we have to pay attention, because once again, when Russia has problem inside of country, they always look for foreign enemy or look for some opportunity to engage military somewhere to show that how strong they are. So in this regard, it's extremely important for our nation not be forgotten now in this international agenda, which is overflowing by pandemic issues. And Russia always looks for the political price it could pay for any kind of actions. And if Russians, if Putin and Kremlin see that there is high political price for engagement and for the meddling, in this case, prevention works. Otherwise, our nations and our countries and our statehood are under very serious threats. So that's why when I mentioned Eastern Partnership and cooperation among our countries, I mean not only economic cooperation. From one side, we have to talk about our security problem, but at the same time, we have to show our role and our importance in the post-corona world, because it's obvious that international relations as well as international security architecture will be changed. And of course, our countries need the niche they have to take in this new security architecture and new cooperation. So I think in this regard, we can offer a lot and we can be more useful and interesting to our partners. At the same time, you mentioned oil price, and I also will link with the possible trade wars which world can face in nearest future. In this regard, for Russia, extremely important becoming the international transportation routes. And you know that Georgia is sitting in the middle of East and West, and it creates the opportunity for the cooperation between Europe and Asia. So, of course, Russia will try to control such kind of routes and not allow countries cooperate beyond their territories. And of course, they will attempt to control all kind of transportation routes, because it's extremely important for the Russian budget, for the Gazprom, Russian railway, and so on.
Thank you, Tengiz, and thank you. And thank you for
mentioning. And last but not least, when it comes to Georgia, you know that this year we have election in October. And of course, it's also kind of target for Russia because parliamentary election in Georgia, it's extremely important. And of course, we will try to meddling in this election. And we also already see some obvious sign of their engagement in this process.
Thank you. And it's great, again, that you mentioned regional cooperation and the possibilities, and Oksana mentioned this before as well, of cooperation between Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. And I think we haven't seen enough of that to sort of create a nucleus of cooperation between these frontrunners, let's call them that, of the Eastern Partnership. But also I hope to come back to the future of this format, for these countries' prospects to become part of the European Union. And as you know, there is a new strategic document coming from the Commission that seems, critics say, a little not very ambitious in terms of how the Commission approaches the future of these countries. But before we move the conversation, I'd like to turn to Nicu and ask him about the impact of the coronavirus on Moldova's security. And interestingly, I think Oksana mentioned the dependence of political elites on Russia and the oligarchic system of governance. I think Moldova has a similar trajectory, particularly accentuated in the last couple of months. Nicu, perhaps you can also address that.
Thank you, Corina. Hi, everybody. I'm sorry I'm not on video, but my internet line is probably not good enough for that. So you'll have to bear with my voice and horrible accent in English rather than my looks. On Moldova. So I think what is striking with Moldova on the kind of basic coronavirus statistics is that it has a much higher infection rate than either Ukraine or Georgia. So if you believe in numbers, and these numbers are all, I think, not entirely reflecting the reality, but Georgia basically has 2 deaths per 1 million people. Ukraine has 6 deaths per 1 million people, and Moldova has 29. So it's 15 times more than Georgia does, which is a huge number. On this, Moldova is more in line with Romania, Macedonia, more than Bulgaria. That's partly because human contacts with Europe as a share of the population have been greater. Lots of Moldovans work in North Italy, for example, or used to work, but also the fact that the government managed terribly the first month and a half of this crisis by giving conflicting advice. You had the government itself and the prime minister trying to keep people at home, and you had the president kind of dismissing coronavirus as a simple virus that some people might not even notice if they had it, and toying and playing with the church on issues of church attendance around Easter. So basically, because of these two things, Moldova has faced a much worse number of deaths than either Georgia or Ukraine or Russia or Bulgaria did. Then, the way Russia, because we started talking about Russia, the way Russia plays into this crisis is somewhat different. As things stands now, Moldova has a government that is on very good and friendly terms with Russia. Its main international backer is Russia, so you don't get this kind of conflicting dynamic that Tengiz was describing in the case of Georgia. But what you have in Moldova is that Russia now, a few days ago, offered more like 10 days ago, signed a loan offer with Moldova of 200 million. And that's not a major story unless you read the fine print of that loan. And apparently they try to smuggle into that loan agreement a way to force on the Moldovan government some private debt that could be created by companies and then offloaded to the Moldovan and turn it into a Moldovan public debt. So you have a pretty kind of complicated situation around this loan in Moldova. The Constitutional Court for now said that the loan agreement with Russia is not valid and they are reviewing it and they should come up with an opinion, hopefully today or tomorrow. But there is a major controversy on how Russia tried to use this loan to gain leverage and potentially increase the size of Moldova's public debt vis-a-vis Russia. And in parentheses, this game might be about forcing on Moldova to assume responsibility for some 7 billion euro in debt that the region of Transnistria has vis-a-vis Gazprom. And it's a debt that has been accumulating for decades since Transnistria has not been paying Russia and Gazprom for gas, for its gas consumption. So what you see in the case of Russian actions in Moldova is a way to try and force on Moldova's current and future governments, 7 billion loan, at least as a way to gain a leverage in the future.
Thank you, Niku.
But you, maybe if I have another minute,
yes,
you spoke about, to what extent oligarchs, Russian governments are relevant in such a situation. And I think what you have in Moldova, again, is a government that is very pro-Russian, that is very isolated in the European Union, in its relations with the United States. But at the same time, in Moldova, you have a situation where the country is structurally very, very tied to the European Union. Some 70% of external trade go to the European Union. So in this sense, whatever government you have in Moldova, the country is way too dependent on the European Union and much less dependent on Russia. And this kind of economic and commercial structure plays a big role in limiting Moldova's kind of dramatic foreign policy U-turns, and this kind of structural dependency are good at keeping Moldova more or less anchored in the European mainstream.
Thank you for mentioning that, Niku, because this helps us segue into a brief conversation about the Eastern Partnership format. And you alluded to a war of narratives that we've seen in all of these three countries, by which Russia is trying to accredit the idea that they're the main economic partner, or should be, or could be the main economic partner for these countries, and not the EU. And I think the numbers look differently. How does the situation look? Moldova will have elections in the fall, presidential elections. How will the loan and this dynamic between what the public knows about the EU and what they're being fed through media and the current government, how will that play out in the context of the elections in the fall?
It is very likely that the elections will be a rather tight race. And it's very likely that a few percent, 4, 5, 6% of voters will actually decide the outcome of this election. So you start having a conversation in Moldova where there are increasing fears that the way to gain those elections will be by setting up some voting fraud schemes with Transnistrian voters, and there is a risk that there will be attempts to bus in massively and buy the votes of Transnistrian residents with Moldovan passports. And that might easily amount to 3, 4, 5% of the vote if the situation is not monitored closely. And the second strategy to kind of affect the election results and affect this relatively possibly tight race will be the risk of tactics to suppress the diaspora vote. At the same time, it's too early to tell. Everyone knows there will be a major economic crisis, but we don't know yet when will it hit hardest. Will the government have enough funds to hide this economic crisis before the presidential elections in autumn? We don't know how a lot of the Moldovan diaspora returnees who have been returning from Italy, from France, from the UK, what will be their impact on the voting dynamics. So there are too many unknowns for now to talk in details about the elections in autumn and its possible outcome.
Thank you. Before turning to questions coming from the audience, Niku talked briefly about the economic crisis that we're all expecting as a result of this global pandemic. And recently, the European Union has extended a lifeline, so to speak, with significant funding to all Eastern Partnership countries. I think the highest amounts went to Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. How does the structure of incentives and conditionalities play out in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova at this stage? Does the Eastern Partnership retain its leverage to actually be conducive to real reform in these countries and bringing the countries closer to the European Union? Or because I think we're used to seeing a lot of window dressing. There has been some real progress, but also a lot of backsliding on that progress. So perhaps how do you assess the future of this format of cooperation, and perhaps the prospects of your countries in joining the Western Alliance, broadly speaking? I'll turn to Oksana again. Oksana, I think you need to unmute yourself.
Excuse me. Thank you. Usually, what happened with the conditionalities when the financial assistance came to Ukraine from, for example, from the EU or from the United States, it worked like this. There was the group of people in the parliament who were very much oriented, like the reform-oriented, let's say, yeah. Even though I don't like the word, but or Western-oriented. Very active civil society and Western money. So we had the the collusions of the common efforts of those three sources: the money, the civil society, and the politicians. Currently in Ukraine, the situation looks a little bit different, and partially just because of the pandemic, because people, as I mentioned, they went to this micro level. So it's you can literally feel it, and I believe it's not only in Ukraine that people are less interested in politics. They are losing their focus. It's easier to manipulate because all is on TV, and the TV belongs to certain group of people, and civil society is a bit frustrated, and the parliament is very much weakened because the presidential faction, the presidential group in the parliament, they already lost their unanimity, and they cannot find the consensus so easily, and others they don't have their so clear agenda and enough support to push it through. So even though their support is crucial, support that comes from the West, it's very important. Now in those conditions, as I described it, it's way more difficult to ensure that having received the support, we can push for specific benchmarks to be achieved, for the specific goals to be achieved. And I think this is one of the side effects of the pandemic as well, that we are observing now in the country. And we will have to cope it. And the one more thing to add, as it was mentioned already by my colleagues from Georgia and Moldova, that we will have the same challenge of the elections that are coming, local elections that are coming this year in Ukraine, but the hidden threat, but enormous threat, is the threat to hold the elections on the occupied territories. It's impossible to ensure any legitimacy of those elections, even though Russia is pushing for this election, and unfortunately the current government, the president and the government, they are also trying to arrange for the local elections on the occupied territories.
Thank you, Oksana. We actually have a question from the audience about the Donbass, and we'll come back to that. Turning to Tengiz on Eastern Partnership.
Thank you. Coin has two sides. So when we are talking about the crisis, crisis itself has as a litmus test which indicates who is friend and who is real enemy. And often we're talking about how to counter Russia propaganda. I think this cooperation, what we are witnessing now between our countries and the European Union, is the best example because people really see the tangible results. And this support from the European Union, as well as with United States and other countries, are essential for our countries. Their further integration in the Western alliances to our European future. When it comes to the Eastern Partnership itself, of course, the future of Eastern Partnership as the initiative is unclear. You know that our countries are demanding for the political statement about European perspective. But at the same time, it's clear that today the EU is too much busy with its internal problem. And I think we have to understand this reality and talking more about practical dimension, practical instruments, which makes EU more tangible for our population from one side, and at the same time, it creates perception among EU member states that our countries are already there. So if we will take this as a goal to, let's say, sectoral cooperation and sectoral integration, even without political promise, and if the businessman in the EU or lawyer or any others has this perception that dealing with Georgia or dealing with Ukraine or dealing with Moldova is the same like have a business with any kind of European country, it will make our task easier, and it will open new opportunities for countries like we are, because once again, today, the EU is not ready for the political statement. Of course, development on Balkan countries, it gives us hope, and we understand the door is open, but once again, the EU is not ready for immediate political action. So we have to understand this. We have to think about practical dimension. We have to develop our practical cooperation, not only in the framework of Eastern Partnership. We have to think about the projects beyond the Eastern Partnership. For instance, 3C Cooperation Initiative, which is excellent and opens opportunity for cooperation in Black Sea, Adriatic and Baltic region. But let's engage in this cooperation Ukraine, let's engage Georgia, let's engage Moldova. It will be much more beneficial for the EU countries, EU nations, and also it will indicate importance of our countries.
Thank you, Tengiz. Niku, you've already touched on the issue of how enmeshed Moldova actually is with the European Union. There was a paper that your institute recently published, co-authored by two Moldovan experts, requiring a little bit more hands-on governance or involvement from the EU. What would, given the history of how the Eastern Partnership, the association agreements and DCFTA has played in practice in Moldova, where do you see Moldova going in this framework, just briefly? If you can unmute yourself.
Yes, I almost finalized my answer, but so there's several things. If you allow me, first I'll very quickly touch on aid and assistance in this context of coronavirus. And I think what's happening now is that countries need two types of assistance. One is urgent short-term medical equipment, and the second type is mid-term economic and financial aid. And the problem of the EU is that the European Union doesn't have masks to give to countries that need them, right? The EU doesn't even have masks and medical equipment for itself, so it's kind of been quite absent from this urgent mask diplomacy that enmeshes large parts of the world. And the Chinese have done quite well. There's a striking opinion poll in Moldova where people were asked who do they think Moldova gets most assistance from in the context of coronavirus, and 30% said China because of one cargo plane flying into Chisinau. 15% said the EU, and 15% said Russia. So what you had was the EU kind of promising and offering hundreds of millions of euro in the midterm to help stabilize the Moldovan economy. But, you know, a single aircraft flying in with masks and medical equipment, and half of it was paid, and the other half was Chinese assistance, kind of bought China much more visibility with the public than hundreds of millions of euro offered or, you know, promised by either the EU or Russia for that matter. On the Eastern part, so the EU is in a difficult moment, I think, now. Then the second element is that the EU has been promising quite a lot of money to the Balkans, the southern neighborhood, the eastern neighborhood, including Moldova. But the EU kind of is squeezed between two imperatives. One is that it wants to help these countries. It wants to help stabilize their economies. The European Union doesn't need a series, you know, a dozen bankrupt states on its borders. And in March, just a month and a half ago, Lebanon, for example, went bankrupt. So the EU definitely doesn't want 20 or 15 Lebanons in its neighborhood in terms of bankruptcy. So it significantly relaxed the conditionality that was usually attached to EU assistance, just in order to showcase its solidarity with the neighbors. But I think in a few months, the EU will be back on this more conditional track and on the track of more conditional funding. If you ask me then on the Eastern Partnership, what next? I think the single biggest need and ambition the Eastern Partnership should have is to start developing a proper security dimension. The European Union has been very shy about playing a role in helping Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine to boost and beef up their security institutions. The EU has been very good in giving money, assistance, free trade area, visa-free regime, helping with energy diversification. The EU has done, you know, dozens and dozens of super useful things, but the EU really shied away from links to the military, to the intelligence services, to the cybersecurity agencies in Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia. So the next decade, if you want, I think it's very important for the Eastern Partnership policy to start addressing this major lacuna, if you want, in the Eastern Partnership. Not least because you can invest a lot of money into free trade with Ukraine, but if you wake up with a war next day, you know, there's only a limited amount of goodwill and stabilization that the Eastern Partnership can bring, unless it deals with security issues as well, and helps Moldova, and helps Ukraine, and helps Georgia beef up their security apparatuses.
Thank you, Niku. We have 13 minutes left, and I want to turn to the questions from our audience. Most of them are security related. A question for Oksana from Tony van der Togt from the Clegendale Institute in the Netherlands. Any opportunity to use the corona crisis to establish a working ceasefire in Donbass, allowing humanitarian assistance to better reach the area in cooperation with the Red Cross and OSCE? If you could tackle this very briefly.
Thank you very much. Once again, unfortunately, ceasefire cannot be achieved until Russia is interested to maintain ceasefire, because there is no conflict on the east of Donbass, or the east of Ukraine. There is no conflict on the east of Ukraine. There is Russian-Ukrainian war. And in this war, Russia is taking active part. And during the whole period of the pandemic, each of the day we have casualties. We have the thousands of people either shot or killed or wounded during all this period. So that's why for Russia, yes, they do claim the lift of sanctions in the Security Council, UN Security Council, but at the same time they are killing people every day on the Ukrainian territory. And one more thing, don't think that the war can be ended without Crimea, without returning of Crimea. This is exactly the objective of Russia, to trade off So to bargain, to give back the occupied territories on Russian conditions, and to keep the Crimea, to control the Black Sea. And if anyone agree on this, doesn't matter whether Ukrainian government or international community, it means that we open the gate for the new war. So this is my clear statement.
Thank you, Oksana. Staying also on the issue of security, here's an interesting proposal from Peter Borisov, who is wondering what our panelists' thoughts are on a proposal to form a new alliance of frontline nations as a first response, non-nuclear deterrent to Russian aggression. This would complement NATO and be supported by NATO. I'll turn to Tengiz, because Tengiz, the sort of common assessment of Georgia is that Georgia is already prepared to be in NATO. So maybe you can take this.
With pleasure. Thank you for the question. You know, actually, when we're talking about threats, we should bear in mind that fear does more harm than the things of which we are afraid. So many things depend on our perception and on our behavior. So that's why, of course, we have to think beyond existing frames and think about how to open new opportunities, how to open new opportunities for our security and for European and transatlantic security. And in this regard, what we need strategy. We need strategy and we need policy, because today still we are talking case by case. We are talking about Georgian case. We are talking about Ukrainian case. We are talking about Moldovan case. But we are not talking about an acceptance of Russian policy towards the neighboring country. We are not talking about the unacceptance of policy to meddling in the election, to military engagement in the neighboring countries, and so on. So that's why we should talk about unified policy, which will secure our countries, our nations, and Euro-Atlantic security at all. Because security of Europe, security of the EU, it can't be achieved without security of Ukraine, without security of Moldova, without security of Georgia. And in this regard, of course, the Black Sea plays significant role. And I really welcome these initiatives which elaborated now in the process of elaboration in NATO regarding the Black Sea. And by the way, I forgot to mention that despite of coronavirus, 3-4 weeks ago, we had NATO military drills on the Black Sea, where Georgia Coast Guard also take part. So initiatives like this, despite are they huge or small steps, are essential. So we have to move forward. We have to look for new opportunities, and we have to keep our dynamic and think about prevention.
Thank you very much. And as we are approaching the end of our webinar, I'll take one more question, and I'll offer our panelists also the opportunity to give us sort of their final thoughts. There was a question from Eugen Bold coming back to the way the Kremlin has been using the crisis to acquire more power and influence. The question is, what can you and the members of your societies do to help counter the propaganda and disinformation and highlight the benefits of a stronger alliance with the US and the EU? We'll start with Niku this time, and please use this opportunity to also offer sort of final remarks if you have any.
Listen, I think we all know what Russia today and Sputnik are doing, but I don't know the kind of key explanations as to why this gets a lot of traction. And the same, by the way, applies for China, is when countries like Russia or China have local domestic kind of propaganda multiple, So when you have presidents that kiss the Chinese flag, when you have media owned by local oligarchs that anti-Russian Chinese messaging, this is when these efforts actually gain much more traction than now. So in this sense, I think that's all also a dimension that matters a lot, and where we as in countries could potentially do more to contain this kind of multiplication of external propaganda efforts. I think I will stop here to allow for another round of reactions. No?
Thank you, Nico. Oksana?
Yeah, so I think that it's time to acknowledge that Eastern Partnership is the construction. It was good for the specific period of time, that it was the good expectations and the plans whatsoever. And I do agree with my colleagues, and first of all with Stengiz, that but actually both with Nico, that it's probably the time to reconsider, to look for the additional formats. It doesn't mean that we have to deny of something or whatever, but the reality is different, and the Eastern Partnership format now definitely needs either the rebirth, or to I would even consider the broader format, because I do agree that the major focus should be now made on at least on the Baltic Black Sea region cooperation. If you don't do this in time, unfortunately we will give Russia even more leverage and strength in this region. The only way to stop and prevent Russia from escalation in the region and from gaining more political support and influence, it's actually to cooperate closely in the Baltic Black Sea region. Thank you.
Thank you, Oksana. Tengiz, last remarks.
Yeah, when we are talking about Eastern Partnership, please don't forget the main principle of Eastern Partnership: more for more. Today, Eastern Partnership achieved very significant milestone. We have 3 countries, associated countries, and that's why I think we have to think about new format which opens new opportunity for the countries which decided, despite of security challenges and threats comes from Russia, despite this, and those countries were punished for this choice, despite this, they decided to go forward, go on the way of European integration. This is opportunity for us. This is opportunity for the EU.
Thank you, Tengiz. I think that's a great message to end on, especially as we have a new commission in Brussels. There will be a new administration in DC this fall, winter, and I think there will be plenty of opportunities for us to engage again and come up with creative solutions, ideas of how the cooperation might work, both at a regional level, also at a transatlantic level. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to get to all of the questions, but I promise we will be organizing more webinars like this. I'm very grateful to our speakers for taking the time and for offering their insights from the region. And because you've mentioned Black Sea, I want to plug in here an announcement. Our report focusing on Eastern Flank security, looking at the entire region from Baltic to Black, is forthcoming. Keep an eye on that and our work on the Black Sea region and the Eastern Partnership countries. Thank you all very much. Again, we really appreciate your presence.